Bonjour. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse visant à faire le point sur l'ouragan Fiona. Welcome to this press conference regarding Hurricane Fiona. En personne, nous avons l'honorable Dominic LeBlanc, ministre des Affaires intergouvernementales, ainsi que l'honorable Diane Leboutillier, ministre du Revenu national. Joining us virtually, the Honorable Bill Blair, Minister for Emergency Preparedness, the Honorable Anita Anand, Minister of National Defense, the Honorable Sean Fraser, Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, the Honorable Goody Hutchings, Minister of Rural Economic Development, as well as Sean Casey, Member of Parliament for Charlottetown. So ministers will have remarks and then we will proceed to questions. Ministers?
Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you very much. Bon après-midi, everyone. As Hurricane Fiona has now passed through our region, we are seeing all sorts of evidence of the devastation that our Atlantic provinces in eastern Quebec have experienced. And after several intense days of preparation and response, we are now moving from a posture of response to one of recovery. We all know that this recovery will take time, and there are significant challenges, but I want to take this opportunity to assure all Canadians that the federal government is coordinated across all departments, agencies, and ministries, and we are united in our resolve to be there for the people and communities that have been impacted and to work in close collaboration with our provincial and municipal partners. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that we have approved a request for federal assistance for the government of Nova Scotia. Reconnaissance operations have been taking place, and Minister Anand will have more to share on this work. Prince Edward Island continues to experience effects such as localized coastal flooding, downed trees and disruption to roadways, impacts to critical infrastructure, and over half of the population is still without power. And as Minister Macaulay and I announced earlier this afternoon, we have approved the request for federal assistance from the government of Prince Edward Island. The Canadian Armed Forces will be deployed to assist in the clearing of roadways and flooded debris, and while technicians work to restore power grid, we'll be there to assist them. I can also share that we have received and approved this afternoon a request for federal assistance from the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. The Canadian Armed Forces and Transport Canada assets will be deployed to conduct aerial imagery and assessments so that we can get a better sense of the damage that has been experienced in the province. Canadian Armed Forces personnel will also conduct physical impact assessments and support the local authorities in their efforts to ensure the well-being of affected residents. In a disaster like this one, the one that we are experiencing, time is of the essence and a speedy response is what's required. And we have been able to move quickly because of the extensive planning and positioning resources that began early last week in close collaboration with the provinces. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank my provincial counterparts for their close and continuing collaboration, and to all my parliamentary colleagues for their advocacy on behalf of the constituents in their impacted regions. I'd also like, if I may, to take one last moment to mention our matching fund with the Canadian Red Cross. As Canadians, we have a long and proud history of supporting each other through our moments of greatest challenge. The Canadian Red Cross delivers a range of emergency services to those in need, and your donations can help to provide interim housing, clothing, food, and other essential supplies to those who are needing our help right now. You can donate online at www.redcross.ca by calling 1-800-418-1111 or by texting Fiona to 20222 to make a $10 donation. Thank you all very much. Merci beaucoup. And I'd now turn it over to my colleague, Minister LeBlanc.
Alors, bonjour. Good afternoon.
Evening.
This morning, as he did yesterday, the Prime Minister convened a meeting of the Incident Response Group, which I attended along with several of my colleagues present with us today. Senior officials from the Canadian Armed Forces, Transport Canada, Public Safety Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and Fisheries and Oceans, as well as the Canadian Coast Guard, updated us on the situation in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec in the aftermath of Hurricane Fiona. Le Premier ministre a parlé
The Prime Minister
à ses homologues
spoke to
des
his
provinces de
counterparts
l'Atlantique et du
in the
Québec
Atlantic provinces
et
and in
avec de
Quebec,
nombreux
and
députés
with many
des régions
members
touchées.
of Parliament of the
J'ai
affected
moi-même eu
regions.
des
I
nombreux
myself
échanges
have had many
avec les premiers ministres
conversations
de l'Atlantique et
with
mon homologue
Atlantic
québécoise,
premiers and my
ainsi que
Quebec
plusieurs de mes
counterparts, and
collègues
with many of my
parlementaires aussi.
parliamentary colleagues
As
as
the Prime
well.
Minister said yesterday, the Government of Canada stands ready to assist provinces in the cleanup and recovery efforts that will take place over the coming days and weeks. Nous serons là pour
We will
aider
be
les
there
communautés
to help
touchées
the affected
par cette
communities
puissante
by
tempête
this
à se
strong
relever.
storm
Nous
to
savons
recover. And
que
we know
plusieurs familles ont
that
été
many
fortement
families
ébranlées
have been
par
greatly
les
shaken
dommages causés
by the damage
par Fiona.
caused by Fiona.
Au cours des prochaines semaines,
In the coming weeks,
nous travaillerons en
we will work
collaboration avec
in
nos homologues
collaboration with our
provinciaux pour
provincial
les aider à retrouver un
counterparts to
semblant
help
de
them to find
normalité
some type of
le
normal
plus
life as
rapidement
quickly as
possible.
possible.
Hier, le Premier ministre a
Yesterday, the
annoncé
Prime Minister
que nous avons
announced
approuvé une
that we
demande
did
d'aide
approve a
fédérale
request for
en
federal
provenance
assistance
du gouvernement de la
from the
Nouvelle-Écosse.
government of Nova
De
Scotia.
plus, tel
Moreover,
qu'annoncé aujourd'hui
as
par mes
announced today
collègues, les
by
ministres
my
Macaulay et
colleagues,
Blair,
Minister Macaulay and
nous
Blair,
avons aussi
we
approuvé
also
une
approved
demande d'aide
a
fédérale
request for federal
de la part
assistance
du gouvernement de
from the
l'île du
government of
Prince-Édouard.
Prince Edward
Et nous
Island.
venons
And
aussi
we
tout
also
juste
have
d'approuver
just approved
une autre demande
another
d'aide de
request
la
for
part du
assistance
gouvernement
from the
de
government
Terre-Neuve
of
et du
Newfoundland and Labrador.
Les forces armées
The
canadiennes
Canadian Armed
seront
Forces
déployées
will be
pour aider
deployed
à dégager les
to
routes,
help to
à
clear
nettoyer les
roads and
débris
to clean up
laissés
debris
derrière par les
left
inondations
behind by the
et
floods,
aussi permettre
and
aux
also
monteurs de
to
ligne de
allow
faire leur travail
to line
et de
workers to
remettre
do their work
le
and to
réseau
reestablish
électrique
the
en
power
état.
grid.
Lors de crises comme celle que nous vivons
During a crisis
présentement,
like the one we're seeing right
chaque
now,
minute compte.
every minute
Et nous
counts.
avons été en mesure
And
de
we have been
poser
able
des
to
gestes rapidement,
take quick action,
grâce, comme le ministre
thanks,
Blair a
as
bien dit,
Minister has
grâce à
aptly
la
said,
planification
thanks to
et le
planning
prépositionnement
and
de
prepositioning
ressources humaines et de matériel
in terms of
qui
human
a
resources
débuté
and equipment,
la
which
semaine
began
dernière.
last week.
Je vais conclure
I will
en
conclude now
mentionnant
by
le
mentioning
fonds de la Croix-Rouge
the
canadienne.
Red Cross
Vous
Fund.
pouvez venir en aide aux
You
sinistrés
can help
en
those
faisant
affected
un don
by the storm
en
by
ligne
making
au
online donation at
www.croixrouge.ca
www.redcross.ca.
par téléphone
You can
au
also call
1-800
the 1-800 481 1111 number,
ou en textant
or you can text
Fiona
Fiona
au 20
to
22
2022
pour faire un don de $10.
to make a $10
Le gouvernement
donation.
fédéral
The federal government
égalera
will
tous
match
les dons
all
reçus
donations
par le
received
Croix-Rouge.
through the
Et avec ça, je vous
Red Cross.
remercie
And I'd
et je
like to
passe
thank you
maintenant la
and now
parole
give
à
the
ma
floor
collègue,
to my
la
colleague,
ministre
the
Anita
Minister
Anand. So, Anita,
of
over
National
to you.
Defense.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very
Dom.
much.
I want to start off, of course, by expressing my deep concern and sympathies to everyone in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec who is dealing with the devastating effects of Hurricane Fiona. Homes have been destroyed and swept away. Communities have been isolated and thousands of people are without power. And I am thinking of everyone in affected communities, including in my home province of Nova Scotia. Let's start off by discussing CAF support.
To all those affected, help is on the way, and the Canadian Armed Forces are rising to the challenge to support
you. The Canadian Armed Forces are providing assistance from the Immediate Response Unit from 5 Canadian Division in Gagetown, New Brunswick, and the activation of reserves in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI. And I will now provide you with an update on our response province by province. Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, as of 8 o'clock this morning, a Canadian Army reconnaissance team from the 5th Canadian Division was on the ground in Cape Breton working with provincial authorities to evaluate the damage and to identify what military capabilities, including equipment and personnel, can best assist. 3 platoons are available to assist the province, and most personnel are already at work today. Nous fournirons de
We will
l'équipement et du
supply
personnel
equipment and
pour
personnel
aider
to
à
help
rétablir
restore
l'électricité, les
electricity,
routes et les
roads,
ponts
and bridges
là où les autorités
where
civiles de la
the
province ont
province's
besoin
civil
de notre
authorities
aide.
need our
Nous sommes
assistance.
également
We
prêts
are also
à
ready
fournir des
to
images
provide
aériennes
aerial
afin que
imagery
la province puisse
so that the province
évaluer
can
le soutien
evaluate additional
supplémentaire
support that is
nécessaire dans
necessary
les
in the
zones qui ne
regions
sont pas
that are not
accessibles
accessible
en raison
because of the
de la
storm.
tempête. Prince Edward Island. Today, we also received and approved a request for assistance from Prince Edward Island for the removal of trees and debris from roadways to assist the restoration of the power grid. And in order to undertake these tasks, the Canadian Armed Forces will be there with 3 platoons available to deploy. Moving on to Newfoundland and Labrador, we just received and approved a request for assistance from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. We've engaged Canadian Rangers to assess the situation in Western Newfoundland, and 3 platoons are available to assist the province. So in other words, to recap, we have approximately 100 personnel per province available to assist in Nova Scotia, in Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. This can rapidly fluctuate if and when additional tasks are determined by the province, and the Canadian Armed Forces stand ready to pull more troops forward that are currently on heightened readiness at the current time. Moving on to Quebec, enfin,
Finally, in the Magdalen Islands, the Canadian Rangers remain our eyes and ears on the ground. They continue to provide us up-to-date information so that we can remain ready to help the province if it is requested. And before I conclude, I'd like to say a word about our other capacities.
The Air Force. The Air Force is establishing an air task force in Gagetown and has placed CH-146, CH-147, CH-148, CC-130, and CP-140 aircraft on high readiness to move. In particular, CP-148 Cyclones and CP-140s are already in Nova Scotia and ready to assist if needed. Following the hurricane, search and rescue operations have resumed normal posture in the region and have conducted operations post-storm. The Navy has a ready-duty ship and small vessels in Halifax, and HMCS Margaret Brooke and HMCS Goose Bay are in St. John's. In fact, HMCS Margaret Brooke will soon commence initial movements towards Western Newfoundland should support to Western Newfoundland or les Îles de la Madeleine be requested. If needs are greater, we will continue to augment our presence from adjacent areas. So let me close by saying that federal assistance is going to continue to be assessed on a daily basis. And this remains an all-hands-on-deck effort. The safety and security of Canadians is our top priority, and with the Canadian Armed Forces, we will continue to do whatever it takes to keep Canadians safe. Le ministère de la Défense
The Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces will continue to work with provincial and federal organizations to determine the best way that we can contribute.
Our Canadian Armed Forces always stand ready to support Canadians. Together, we will get through this. Thank you. Merci, miigwech. And I'll now pass it over to Minister Fraser.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, colleagues. What we've seen on the ground over the last couple of days is unlike anything I've experienced in my own community in Nova Scotia. Thankfully, reports in Nova Scotia of serious injuries are minimal. We really want to say thank you to the Canadian Hurricane Centre for the early warning system, and most importantly to Nova Scotians for taking seriously the advice around emergency preparedness. The level of collaboration between levels of government and amongst colleagues has been stellar to keep the flow of information going. I'd encourage everyone to continue to listen to anyone who's sharing information from Environment Canada about what you should expect. But I got to tell you, things on the ground at home are pretty rough in northern Nova Scotia and through Cape Breton. The experience trying to get you through your community is near impossible depending on where you live. It's hard to drive a couple of blocks without finding debris that's blocking your path. We continue to see power crews out trying to remedy the situation, but on every street corner, you are seeing large trees taken down into the power lines. Connectivity remains somewhat challenging, but I thank everyone who's working to ensure we're still able to communicate with one another. I've got some real concerns about the impact of the severe weather event we've experienced over the last few days on the fishery, our harbor infrastructure in particular, and some of the farms in our communities who are reporting lost crops and cornfields and damage to farm buildings and equipment. But through all this difficulty, I have to say the spirit of Nova Scotians are really showing us what they're made of. In response to difficulties, continuing power outages, we've got neighbors who are cooking whatever they've had in the freezer on the barbecue, who those who have a generator are offering to their neighbors to come over for a cup of coffee or to plug their phones in so they can stay in touch. We've had a real scare in my own community with a young boy who was reported missing, with many people showing up and thankfully finding him safe from harm. Folks, when you grow up on salt water, you learn how to weather some pretty cruel storms. But I can tell you, I've never been so impressed to count my neighbors amongst my friends. We're going to continue to be there as federal government to help people support people through the recovery, and very happy to continue to have the support of the federal government. Happy to pass it over to my colleague, Minister Hutchings, for a view of the ground in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, colleagues. Friends, it is devastating in Western Newfoundland and Southwest Newfoundland. As we've all said, Hurricane Fiona has touched down with just a vengeance. Sadly, there is a woman in Port of Basques who has been washed out to sea. I know we're very hopeful. Coast Guard is engaged, and we're very hopeful that she can be found. So our thoughts and prayers are with Port of Basques and the family at this time. I know everyone is working 100% to make sure that we have a good outcome there. So Coast Guard does have one helicopter on the ground. There's another one en route, and it's probably there by now. Good news, Marine Atlantic, the way the seas died down magically. So Mother Nature does have a good soul some days. The seas have died down, and Marine Atlantic started off midday today with 2 crossings to deal with the backlog, and they'll be back on normal schedule soon. I've been in touch with all my local mayors. I've been chatting with the Premier. I believe he's coming to the area tomorrow. Port of Basques has a few hundred people still displaced from their homes being washed away. The number is growing of the homes that have been impacted and totally destroyed. I've also been talking to Bird Islands and a small island of Ramia off the coast here who've lost their freshwater source. I know the Prime Minister spoke with Mayor Button of Port of Basques this afternoon, and again continued our support on every federal government department. And as my colleague Minister Fraser was saying, I had reached out from the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to say, please assure everyone that any infrastructure that Small Craft Harvest is responsible for will be assessed and addressed as soon as possible. We know how important the coastline is for our communities. Look, it's been tough, and it's going to be tough over the coming days, coming weeks, months, and sadly, it's going to be, we're looking at a long time before we get some of this infrastructure replaced. I still have to say, please, please, please listen to the authorities. It's still a state of emergency in some areas. And in the meantime, please stay safe, everyone. I'll be in Port of Basques shortly, and I'll be able to report firsthand on our next presser. Thank you to my colleagues, and thanks to each and everyone on this screen for the diligent work. Friends, the federal government is going to be there to help get us through this.
Merci beaucoup à
Thank you
tous mes
very much.
collègues.
I'd like to thank
J'aimerais
all my
d'abord prendre
colleagues.
un instant pour
First, I'd like to take
remercier
a
les
moment to
bénévoles
thank
et
the
les premiers
volunteers
répondants.
and the first
Ces cellules de
responders.
crise qui font un travail
There are
important qui
crisis cells that are
consiste à
doing
assurer
important
la
work
sécurité
to ensure
de
the safety
toute la population.
of
J'ai
the
parlé aux
entire
maires, aux
population. I
préfets
have
de la
spoken
région
with
qui ont
the
été
mayors of
touchés
the
dans mon
region that were
comté.
affected in my
Comme j'ai
riding.
déjà souligné
And
à
as I've
plusieurs
already said on
reprises,
several
les Maginot
occasions,
et les
the
Gaspésiens
people of
sont des gens
the Magdalen
résilients.
Islands and the people of the Gaspésie
Cependant,
are
la
very
population
resilient.
reste
However,
inquiète des
people remain
répercussions
concerned
engendrées
about
par
the
la crise
impacts
climatique.
created by the climate
Les gens ce
crisis.
matin, lorsque j'ai fait
When
des
I
téléphones, me
called
disaient,
people this morning,
Diane, on
people
n'a
said,
jamais vu
Diane,
la
we
mer
have never
aussi
seen
déchaînée.
the sea
Et
so wild.
j'entendais ce matin
And
aussi
this morning I also
homardier, un
heard
pêcheur d'homard des îles de Cap-aux-Meules,
lobster
M.
fisher
Cormier,
from
qui
Cap-aux-Meules,
disait,
Mr. Cormier, who
j'ose
said,
espérer
I
qu'il y ait
that
des gens qui ne croient
there are
pas à la
people.
crise climatique. Pour moi, là, c'est impossible.
Well, I can't imagine
avec tout
people
ce
who
qui se
don't believe in
passe.
the climate
On a
crisis.
vu
What's
que les
happening right now
dommages aux
is
infrastructures
flabbergasting.
liées aux
We have
pêches
seen
sont
damage
considérables.
to fishing
Et en
infrastructure
tant que
that is
moteur
considerable,
économique des îles de la
and
Madeleine, les
Magdalen
efforts de
Islands
reconstruction et de
will
réparation
need
seront
repair and
cruciaux.
restructuring
Il
efforts which
s'appelle
will be
évident
crucial. It
que nous
is
devons bâtir
obvious
des
that we have to build
infrastructures
infrastructure
capables
that
de
is
faire
able
face à la
to
réalité
face
à
the
laquelle nous vivons
reality that we're
maintenant.
experiencing right now.
La phase d'évaluation
The
des dégâts
evaluation
est en
phase
cours
of the damage is
et bien que le
underway,
réseau
and
routier
while
aux
the
îles de
road
la Madeleine
network
soit à
in the
nouveau
Magdalen Islands
accessible,
is once again
la
accessible,
population est priée
people
de demeurer
are
chez
asked to
elle, de
remain at
continuer à faire
home
preuve de
and to
prudence,
continue
de
to show
limiter ses
caution,
déplacements
to
et
avoid
surtout
traveling,
de
and most
modérer la
important,
consommation d'eau
to
potable.
moderate their
Mon
consumption of
équipe de
drinking water.
circonscription est sur le terrain et je
People
dois
are on
dire
the
que je suis
ground,
de tout
and
cœur
I
avec tous mes collègues de
am
l'Atlantique. Je remercie
showing
aussi
my
tous
support
les
to all of my
Canadiens
Atlantic
qui sont
colleagues. I'd
à nos
also like
côtés.
to pay tribute to
Ensemble,
all
nous sommes toujours
Canadians.
plus forts.
We're always
Merci.
stronger together.
Je
Thank
passerai
you.
maintenant
I
la
will now give
parole
the
à
floor
Sean
to
Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you very
Ministre.
much, Minister.
I am going to try to give you a bit of a snapshot of what we're seeing here in Prince Edward Island. The story is quite similar to what you heard from Minister Hutchings and Minister Fraser. It's difficult to give you a full and accurate picture given the challenges we have with connectivity. So the information that I have is largely based on a long run that I did around the community today because it's hard to get anywhere by car. So you have to do it on foot if you're going to go off the main roads. And also based on a call that the Prime Minister convened earlier today, on which the cell service was good enough to hear a report from some of my colleagues. So I'm a bit biased to the level of information by what's in the urban center of Charlottetown, but we heard today from our colleagues that there has been substantial damage incurred in the small craft harbors in Prince Edward Island. In PEI, this was largely a wind event. And because it was a wind event, there are an awful lot of trees uprooted, an awful lot of trees that have fallen on power lines. There are power lines down. Last night, practically the entire island had no power. I understand that power is being restored now, but personally and in and around Charlottetown have not yet seen that. This afternoon, for the first time, there was a gas station that had gas and a long lineup in front of it because of that. So reconnecting to power and cell phones is going to be a challenge, and the assistance of the federal government and the Canadian Armed Forces Reserves in that regard is very, very welcome news. So pleased that the Premier made the ask, pleased that the Feds responded in such a timely and affirmative fashion. What I can tell you, though, is today it's a beautiful day. The sun is shining, and everywhere you go around town, what you hear are generators and chainsaws. And what you don't hear is a real sense of despair. We have here in Prince Edward Island great faith in Maritime Electric. The communications that comes from Maritime Electric is always transparent and timely. You get people have a sense of confidence in them. It was heartening to see electric boom trucks from other provinces traveling along the bypass today. So reinforcements have been called in. The sense on the streets is one of shock and awe over the magnitude of the storm, but also a sense of we got this. We knew it was coming. We were ready, and now we got a project on our hands, and we're going to deal with it. That is the overwhelming sense that you get on the streets. So pleased to be part of this conference, and extremely grateful for the work of Ministers Blair and Anand in responding to the request for help from Prince Edward Island. Thanks, everyone.
Merci beaucoup. On va passer aux
Thank you.
questions des
We will
journalistes.
now move to questions from the journalists, starting with those in the room and then on Zoom. If you have questions, please use the raised hand function to indicate you have a question on Zoom.
Questions, starting with questions in the room. For people on Zoom, please use the raised hand function if you do have a question, and I will unmute you. So we will start with Rafi Bouchkanyan, CBC News.
Bill, do you want to say something, and perhaps Goody as well? And obviously, Rafi, we were just informed of this as well. And this is, again, a tragic reminder of how these storms can bring personal devastation to families and to communities. So obviously, we're thinking of the family here and the community. But perhaps my colleague, Bill Blair, or Ms. Hutchins would like to add something. Sorry, Bill, those famous words, you're on mute, Bill.
Thanks very much, Dom. And it is very unfortunate, but we've received a word now from the RCMP confirming that the body of the woman that was washed out to sea at Port of Basque has now been recovered. And it is a reminder, in fact, and how truly dangerous this storm has been. And certainly our thoughts are with the family and with that community. And with that, I think this is a town that Goody represents and knows very well, and I'll turn it back over to her.
Thanks for that, Bill and Dom. Yes, Port of Basque is a small town, around 4,000 people. Everybody knows everybody. And I am looking forward to being on the ground there now shortly, and I will be stopping by and passing the condolences of all of us on the screen and all Canadians to her family. It shows the power of the water. And as Sean said, and both Seans know, living in coastal communities, we know what can happen. And tragically, the sea has taken another from us. Thanks so much.
Thanks. And as a follow-up, what specific help to communities such as Port au Basque, where we know that people have lost their entire houses in some cases, can they rely on support from the federal government?
So perhaps I can...
Yeah, Rafi, go ahead, Don.
No, so, Bill, I was just going to begin by saying I have spoken to Premier Fury, as I know my colleagues have as well. He has raised with me yesterday the issue of the destruction to personal property by the storm, the many houses and properties that were damaged. His government will be doing an assessment, and obviously will be there to help. There are well-established disaster financial assistance mechanisms that the province will avail itself of. And the Government of Canada will support those families in that community. But perhaps, Bill Blair, you should add some details with respect to that specific issue around some of the property damage that I know the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador has identified.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. And clearly the property damage is excessive. That assessment has begun immediately, and we've been working very closely with all of our provincial partners to make sure that when the dollars are required to facilitate that recovery, we'll be able to move as quickly as possible. But I also wanted to point out that one of the important things that the Red Cross brings to each of our communities, and why they're such an important partner to us, is the Red Cross will register those people who have been impacted by these things. And we know that the most immediate impact for very many people is the loss of housing and shelter. And so arrangement of interim housing, as well as providing them with, perhaps some funding to assist with the immediate needs with respect to food and supplies. That's something that we work very closely with the Canadian Red Cross. It's why yesterday the Prime Minister announced that we are matching all donations given to the Red Cross. And we've seen other disasters, and most recently in British Columbia during the extensive flooding that they experienced last year, a partnership between the Canadian Red Cross and our government and making sure that the generosity of Canadians flows directly and very effectively to make sure that people have the resources they need in their immediate time of need is critically important, because the recovery is going to take some time. It takes time to rebuild houses, and our first priority right now, of course, is the restoration of power and utilities, and to open up those roadways so that we can get those essential supplies to the people that are going to need them. But the Canadian Red Cross and the federal government working together will make sure that the resources are there for people who need it.
Okay. We're going to go with Lee Berthiaume, Canadian Press.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Lee Berthiaume, Canadian Press. I wanted to ask, first of all, if there's any plans for the Prime Minister to travel out east and survey some of the damage.
Perhaps in the meeting of the incident response group with my colleagues this morning, he expressed to us what he expressed, I think, in this room yesterday, his desire, obviously, to see the affected communities, to thank the remarkable people that are working on the recovery and cleanup. But it's a function of going at the appropriate moment. The Prime Minister visiting these communities in no way should take away from the first responders and the people who are, in fact, helping with the connectivity issues, restoring power, opening up the roadways. So there'll be an appropriate moment, we hope soon, where it's responsible for him to visit. And I know he's shared with our colleagues in the House of Commons his desire to be there himself and to visit these communities that have been so deeply affected, but it's a matter of choosing the appropriate moment where it's responsible to do so.
And the Nova Scotia Premier earlier today said that the ArriveCan app actually delayed the arrival of assistance from the U.S., that there were some workers from Maine who were trying to come in and that they were unable to get in. Can you comment on that? And, will the ArriveCan app and other travel restrictions be lifted or expire on September 30th?
Bill, do you want to address that, Bill Blair?
Yeah, I've been in regular and hourly contact with officials in Nova Scotia. I'll tell you, it's all hands on deck for every department and ministry of the Canadian government, including CBSA and our border officers, to get the help into Canada, into Nova Scotia as quickly as possible. And any delay was, quite frankly, inconsequential. Everybody's doing everything possible, and the work has continued unabated. We were well prepared and fully anticipated the power disruptions that were taking place. The province of Nova Scotia was already mobilizing significant power crews to get out there and do that work. We're very grateful for the help that has come from Quebec and also from the United States. And of course, we're all doing everything possible to make sure that help arrives as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Okay. We're going to go on Zoom. So starting with Salman Farouki, Globe and Mail.
Hi there. I wanted to ask specifically about some of the coastal damage to individuals' houses. I was talking to the Insurance Bureau of Canada and understand that pretty much all homeowners will be uninsured for the coastal damage from storm surge and salt water. And I wanted to ask if the federal government will be stepping in to support those people if they're uninsured.
And perhaps if I may, I think that's something I can respond to. We have within the federal government an arrangement called the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement. It's a mechanism whereby we work very closely with the provinces who determine eligible expenses, and then certainly in those uninsured damages to residents and businesses, coastal infrastructure would certainly be qualified for this. And through the provinces, they determine an assessment of what needs to be done, and they make requests for us. We've been working very closely with the provinces, all of them, in our discussions about utilizing the resources available through the disaster financial assistance arrangement. And we have undertaken to them that we'll work very closely and very quickly in order to get the resources into those communities and to help in the recovery as quickly as possible. But this is a well-established procedure and process that we work very closely with the provinces. The provinces have the primary lead, as it should be. They're there and they're on the ground. But I want to assure them and all Canadians they have a good partner in us, and we'll be coming as quickly as is necessary to help people in this time of need.
And perhaps I could just add to what Bill Blair said. It's as I mentioned, Premier Fury has raised this with me directly yesterday. His concern about precisely the potential for significant uninsured losses that these homeowners and these property owners are facing. So I think the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, as Bill said, is very, very much seized with this issue. They'll be doing the evaluations, and they know very well, and I repeated it to the Premier, as I know Bill and Goody and others have with the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, that the government of Canada, with this long-standing existing arrangement that the provinces know well, will be a reliable partner and will move quickly. And I remember a similar circumstance, I think about 4 years ago, with some severe flooding in and around Fredericton, New Brunswick, Quispam-Sis, along the St. John River Valley. There were significant losses that families endured as a result of very, very, very massive flooding. And we work with the province of New Brunswick under this arrangement, as Bill Blair said. So we think that the same circumstance will obviously apply in Newfoundland and Labrador, and we'll be happy to work with the province in that regard.
And if I may, Dom, as well, just to be clear, the disaster financial assistance arrangement was designed precisely to deal with those types of catastrophic damage and losses that are not insured or not insurable. And that's why we have that program. It's worked very effectively in other jurisdictions right across the country. We've already engaged very effectively, I think, with all of the provinces who've experienced this damage, and we'll work closely with them to make sure that the resources are available to help in the recovery and rebuild. And it's also really important, and work that we'll also be doing is to make sure that when we do rebuild, it rebuilds with a clear understanding, that we're seeing a greater frequency and severity of these types of storms. And so we want to make sure that rebuild is also, focuses on creating greater resilience for those communities and a safer environment for the people that are potentially impacted by these storms.
And just as a follow-up, I guess I wanted to ask, I know the government for some time now has been working on having some sort of flood insurance program available to all Canadians. And I think it was expected that would be wrapped up within a year. And I guess I'm wondering if an event like this, of this kind of severity, changes anything in that process, if it just changes anything at all.
Yeah, well, it deepens our resolve to get the job done, because I think we've seen lots of evidence in British Columbia last year, and now that the flood insurance program we're talking about is primarily about overland flood insurance, but the need to ensure that Canadians have access to that important resource and in order to protect themselves and to help us all make better decisions about where we build and how we build. It does I think add a sense of urgency to the work that we have undertaken. We began the work of developing, working with private industry and community partners right across the country. We began that work a number of years ago. It's well along, but we've still got work to do. What we are all, I think, even greater resolved as a result of seeing some of the damage that has occurred during this event.
Next off is Rachel Gilmore, Global News.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up with a question about the Arrive Can issue. So, Minister Blair, you said that any delay was quite frankly inconsequential, but I just heard from Nova Scotia Power that the time in between the crews being delayed at the border and them arriving on the ground to help Nova Scotians was a few hours. Do you not think a few hours is consequential in a situation like this where so many are without power?
Well, Rachel, simply that's not consistent. I was advised that there was a concern about it, and before any steps could be taken, the matter was resolved. I know everybody and our officers at CBSA and public safety, every federal department working with our provincial partners. We're working to get this done. Everybody understands the urgency of getting those resources quickly into community. There was also the storm was still ongoing yesterday morning as some of these events were evolving, and so everybody was moving as quickly as reasonably possible, and we're committed to making sure that recovery moves forward apace.
So I'm just trying to clear this up a little bit because, the Nova Scotia government is saying that they're standing by the fact that this occurred, but you're saying that it was resolved without the need for any intervention. So is that correct? Like, was there absolutely no delay as a result of the Arrive Can app?
I wasn't at the border, Rachel. I can't talk about what interactions may have taken place, but when it was brought to my attention, and like I said, I'm in direct contact with my ministerial counterparts in Nova Scotia, and when the issue was brought to my attention, before we could take any action, it was resolved. Those crews were on their way, and they were out there doing the work that we all so desperately need them to do.
All right, we still have a few minutes with the ministers, so if ever there are any extra questions, please just let me know. Libertion, Canadian Press.
Sure, thank you. Sorry, I've just pulled up my questions here. What did I write down? One question, obviously, we're talking about, we're seeing more of these incidents. I think that's been recognized. A lot of power outages. And I'm wondering, especially when it comes to mitigation, whether there should be a national plan or policy or regulations around the burying of power lines. If that's something that can be considered. I don't know whose jurisdiction that necessarily would be, but, is that something the federal government could be looking at, is looking at, anything like that?
Perhaps I could offer a few comments, and if my colleagues want to add something. I'm, in my capacity as infrastructure minister, we're obviously working with provincial and territorial infrastructure departments and governments around disaster mitigation and adaptation, around building more resilient infrastructure. And my conversations with Atlantic premiers in the last few days have focused on the need for community infrastructure. Obviously, I saw in Bram Village, Francophone community schools, health centers. There's a series, and this is true right around Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec. There's community infrastructure that has been badly damaged. So we are going to be a very present and very reliable partner with provinces in rebuilding this public community infrastructure in a way that's more resilient and adapts better to, as Bill Blair said, these extreme weather events. As you know, the generation and transmission of electricity is properly a provincial jurisdiction. But as it so happens, I'm leading a conversation with my colleagues from Atlantic Canada and the premiers in Atlantic Canada around an Atlantic loop, which could potentially be used as a backbone to bring renewable green energy, largely from the province of Quebec and from Newfoundland and Labrador, but not exclusively, into the grid in Atlantic Canada. So we are engaged with the governments in Atlantic Canada and in Quebec and their utilities in figuring out a way that we can be a partner with them in rebuilding some of this infrastructure that would allow for them to have better access to renewable and greener forms of electricity. So my impression is that this, to come straight to your point, this circumstance in the last few days makes that conversation even more germane. And I would certainly be open to, with provincial utilities, looking at ways the Government of Canada can strengthen the resiliency of that infrastructure. Because as you said, if it's an ice storm we saw in New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island some years ago, or flooding, or an extreme weather event like Fiona, this circumstance is something that's very dangerous. If it happens in January and February, you can imagine the context also in terms of winter conditions. So we would be wide open as a government to figuring out a way that, in a broader conversation about community infrastructure and making it more resilient and adaptive to extreme weather events, that we would look at whether electricity transmission systems can properly be part of that conversation.
Thank you. And a question for Minister Anand. You mentioned that there are, I believe, 100 CAF members ready to respond or are responding in the 4 different provinces. Obviously, the CAF is currently facing a personnel shortage, recruiting crisis, which I've reported on today. I'm curious as to, what assets are available and how stretched the CAF is, whether the personnel shortage is causing problems in terms of, or has the potential to cause problems in responding to this disaster or future disasters.
Okay, thank you so much. Bottom line is that we have the personnel that we need to respond, and we will continue to stand at the ready with this personnel for as long as needed. And just to clarify, it's 100 troops approximately that is available per province. And those troops are in the ground in Nova Scotia at the current time, and they will be on the move very soon regarding Newfoundland and PEI. Protecting Canadians is obviously our top priority, and we have shown the ability to do that and the willingness to do that, for example, in the British Columbia floods last year, and then again here and in climate-related disasters, generally speaking. The heart of your question, though, goes to making sure that in the future we have a military with the numbers to sustain regular operations. And that is a fundamentally important question. And we are looking at both the long-term and the short-term ways to increase recruitment. Taking the short term, we have, for example, been maximizing staffing and recruiting centers and training schools and temporarily shortening basic training. In the long term, we're continuing our work to build an institution where everyone feels safe, protected, and respected and can reach their full potential. So it's an issue, generally speaking, for the Canadian Armed Forces, but on this matter, in terms of Hurricane Fiona and addressing it, we have the resources we need. We have the capabilities we need. I've outlined those in my remarks, and I'll just say we are all hands on deck, ready and willing to assist. And you can see the work that we're doing now on the ground. Thank you.
One last question, Rafi.
Thanks. A few of you mentioned connectivity issues today, and your colleague at Innovation, Science and Industry the other day tweeted that he requested from telecom giants in Canada to provide assurances that they are doing everything they can to make sure everything's connected as quickly as possible. Have you heard anything from telcos on what they're doing?
So, Rafi, I'll offer a few comments, and Bill, Blair, or others may want to add something. I do know, as you noted, that our colleague François-Philippe Champagne, well before the storm hit Atlantic Canada and eastern Quebec, had been in touch with these telephone companies, these telcos, these internet service providers, in order to ensure that they're sharing resources as amongst themselves. I know from my own experience at my place in Grand Digue, New Brunswick, we lost that service on Saturday morning. And I know that the particular service providers were very present. I could see their trucks in some parts of eastern New Brunswick yesterday. But François-Philippe Champagne's insistence with the companies was that they work collaboratively with one another, because in some cases, if you think of in Sean Fraser's province or in other provinces, Eastlink, for example, may have a significant presence in some parts of Atlantic Canada, and other internet service providers should be in a position to share resources in terms of helping them restore this, what is now an essential service. But Bill or others may want to add something to that.
Yeah, just a couple of things, if I may, Dom. I can tell you, in the days leading up to this event, there were convened within each of the provincial emergency operations centers, private sector, including the telecos, were invited and attended at the table, and they were part of our planning and our preparation. There was obviously our colleague Minister Champagne was very clear to them our expectation that they would support each other and that they would work collaboratively. And I think there's been lots of evidence of that good work, and I think it will certainly assist in the speeding of the recovery. But what I understand as well, because we've inquired about this through the day, is many of the internet and cell disruptions that people are currently experiencing are more directly related to the problems we're having restoring hydro utility in many parts of all of the provinces that have been impacted. And that's as a result of trees being down across those lines, and some very significant challenges that debris has to be removed. We've got hydro crews out in every jurisdiction working very hard and diligently to restore that power. But my understanding is that the telecos joined us in preparation, have worked very collaboratively together, and again, just like for the rest of us, it's all hands on deck to restore those important services to Canadians as quickly as possible.
And Dominic, if I may, your comments are right, Minister Champagne, and I've been in touch with the telcos and internet service providers, but this is a form of infrastructure too. The connectivity infrastructure as we go forward. We spoke earlier of how we've got to look at how we build bridges and roads and other infrastructure. It's how we build a connectivity infrastructure too. It has got to be weatherproof as we battle these storms more and more in the future.
Thank you very much. This is all the time we have. So thank you for the ministers for your availability. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. This ends the press conference. Merci.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe.